In their match against one of the current titans of the league, 100 Thieves, TSM's new roster is put to the test here. Although they showed some promise and some upside overall, you can feel their inexperience in multiple areas, including in the way they create their draft philosophies. Jumping into the draft, TSM are on blue side this game. In Phase 1, TSM bans Lulu, Azir, and Lucian. The Lulu ban indicates that TSM have information on certain picks, potentially from scrim information or anything else. There's otherwise no real reason for why they'd ban this in my opinion, but this does mean that 100T have been warping gameplay around their opponents potentially because of this pick. Azir typically has been a strong blind in this meta, he has typically been weak to assassin picks. Any teams also don't really tend to gravitate towards these picks right now, nor has it been meta for the last little while, so it's been very strong to pick in early phases. Lucian is also a relatively standard ban on blue side because of the pairing with Nami, and 100T in particular have been known to perform very well in this pairing and playing through the bot side here. 100T ended up banning Taliyah, Seraphine, and Zeri. Taliyah has come up recently more and has been able to synergize with a ton of backwards comps. She helps provide a ton of siege in these areas, and roam potential in jungle and mid especially. Seraphine and Zeri are also just two picks that you pretty much never really want to give up to a team to a B1 right now, since they're just so incredibly strong. So these are just two regular bans at the moment. The bans round out and TSM end up B1ing Poppy, which is an incredibly high priority pick for jungle right now, stops a lot of the meta picks right now with dashes, so it's been a really key stopper in a lot of drafts right now. In a sense, she can literally dictate and gravitate drafts into certain directions because she potentially limits teams out of so many options right now. Other picks like Gnar were also still available, but even that is affected by something like the Poppy potentially. The only thing with the Poppy is that it's more so a meta shifter, and Poppy herself is mainly a backwards champ, but it seems that many teams are not having an issue with this. 100T respond to the Poppy with an R1 R2 Aphelios Trundle. This is basically an opener that alludes to a strong front to back start, but gives TSM a chance to counter this with their 4 remaining picks. Trundle is not only strong in general right now, but this is an amazing matchup into the Poppy. Aphelios being the ADC pick here is also okay, and I think it's a favorite by FBI, and I think there's a bit more reason for this as well. Kalista can't really be picked here because of the aforementioned Poppy pick. This ties back a bit to the Poppy opener because this can disincentivize picks against the enemy and effectively nets you bans. Because Poppy is also really good into champions like Kalista, B1ing it here can actually negate that Kalista pick and nets you a 4th ban in that sense. We can use this idea when you're strategically blinding certain champions so that you can force the draft in a certain direction as well. Even things like Twitch Yuumi can't really be picked here properly because of the same reason. If Poppy just holds W on top of the Yuumi while she's detached, it becomes impossible for her to maneuver around in fights and such. So when you think about it, there's actually not that many options for ADC remaining. After the R1 R2, TSM actually picked B2 B3 Jinx Rakan. Jinx traditionally is a decent matchup into the Aphelios, being able to match its scaling and pacing in the lane dynamic with the range, and works well with what TSM are going for right now. Rakan is a pick that becomes much more viable and reliant around the conditions he's picked in. He thrives best when you need a combination of a slow laning phase and decent engage / space creation, which is especially the case against comps with high mobility. He trades off lower durability and laning phase strength for this scaling and more flexible forms of CC. With that being said, seeing the R1 R2 of 100 Thieves and not really seeing any requirement for this mobility and flexibility, Rakan in this case is actually relatively low value. In this slot, I would probably have opted for a different support like Renata in this case, or to blind a decent top laner like Gnar or Ornn. This is higher value in slot and leaves potentially more options instead of Rakan here. If I'm TSM in this slot, I'm now also scared of 100T picking things like Zilean or Renata themselves. In R3, 100 Thieves end up picking Tahm Kench R3. It's presumably the pick here to counter the Jinx Rakan lane, and I think it's pretty reasonable to answer the potential engage from TSM on the Rakan. It also makes sense to R3 support on this slot because you are likely saving R5 for the top counter pick, and there's a lot of mid options here available here at the same time. I think 100T had a decent amount of options here, and they could have blinded top here for example, but if they're using the remaining slots and the roles in this order, then Tahm is probably one of the more well-rounded picks against most comps here. Moving on to Phase 2, at this point both teams are relatively committed to front-to-back comps, and the name of the game is being able to outvalue the opponents in this case. Both teams have adequate tools to prevent potential engage, so there isn't much room for discussion in terms of pivoting direction, so a lot will actually ride on the R5 pick, as well as commitment of tools that TSM will have on the B4, B5, so that 100T doesn't get a massive advantage. So 100T actually banned Sylas here, which indicates that 100T have a couple of picks that they're looking to use that Sylas can really counter. TSM respond by banning Ornn, which is a little bit of a response to the Sylas ban, which opens up the Ornn R4. There's a Swain ban coming out from 100 Thieves, which I find super interesting. This could indicate that 100T are potentially looking to pivot for a bit of engage, but I'm not really quite sure at this stage, to be honest with you. It does seem to be a favored pick from Maple though, so it's likely that 100T doesn't really want to deal with this awkward pacing. And then the last ban from TSM is Fiora. This champ's a very potent R5 pick into a lot of potential matchups right now, and it's likely that TSM will feel that their top blind options are limited if this is still left up. we end up going to R4, in which 100 Thieves end up banning Gnar. So this is a very standard R4 pickup, and the strength here is likely more the potential blind pick takeaway from TSM, rather than the strength of picking it up themselves here. So it's a great pick in this slot, however, and puts the onus onto TSM to basically deal with the solid front to back, plus 4 picks 100T have so far. After this, TSM commit all in with a B4, B5 Yone Zoe. So Yone is a great matchup into the Gnar on paper and creates decent scaling into that silent matchup, and the Zoe attempts to round out the comp, creating somewhat of like a poke win condition for TSM to rely on instead. The only real caveat here is that a poke champion like Zoe might have relatively little impact in terms of her overall damage against a comp as tanky as the one that 100T has. In addition, their comp only makes sense directionally if it assumes Soul is split pushing the entire game, which I don't really find realistic. The rest of their comp is great for sieging and encouraging a level of engage out of 100T, but Yone won't really be able to contribute much to these fights or this siege. The Yone can really only engage and go for heavy swings, and Yone can't really function together against the entirety of that comp that 100 Thieves has. 100 Thieves rounds out the draft with an R5 Lysandra, and I think the new playstyle for Lysandra recently is to actually play her a little bit backwards. She's very effective at creating a lot of space for her teammates with her W and ulti, and it's actually pretty nice to use tools like that in order to prevent engages onto your priority targets. In this case, it will be excellent to just deal with the Rakan and Yone engage for this reason. It just breaks both their ankles, and if TSM had more siege than just a Zoe and a top laner that could potentially play backwards instead of Yone, then I'd say that Lysandra would not be a really good pick here, but I think it's not really the case right here, and it's worth the slightly unfavorable matchup. Overall, TSM have a comp here that plays around the 401 and relies on putting a lot of resources into the Yone, whereas 100 Thieves have a more traditional front-to-back comp that revolves around playing towards objectives and strong setup in fights. Because of the easier to pilot fights overall and the decent pressure of being able to play through mid and bot, I'd rate the draft 60-40 in 100 Thieves' favor. 100 Thieves comp has more options and more ways to play its comp together, and I believe that this ease of execution and consistent scaling are what make this draft in their favor. If TSM kept the game chaotic and really invested heavily into their solo lanes, then it's also possible that they could have come out on top here. I believe that both teams made some draft mistakes and could have optimized a bit further in terms of certain slots and playing in specific champion identities and needs, but I think the fact that 100 Thieves played to a consistent comp with a clear strategy is what ended up netting them the victory here. TSM is still experimenting with their new roster, and I think this draft somewhat alluded to the communication and priorities that this team is having in draft, and this causes them to play inconsistent. As always, hopefully this video was insightful to you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one. Stay fresh.